marked the accountant Sullivan and his right-hand lieutenant, Tony Ironhand Malone, controlled Liverpool's streets with a precision no one dared challenge. They were invisible, untouchable, and ruthless, but behind their power lay secrets, betrayals, and a network so vast it stretched across continents. This is the story of how these men built an empire of fear and how it all came crashing down. Liverpool in the late 1980s was a city of contrasts. On one hand, it was a hub of culture, music, and trade, bustling with life along the docks and in the narrow streets of the city center. On the other hand, beneath the surface, a different world thrived, a world ruled by fear, money, and ambition. Small-time criminals and street gangs had long prowled the city, preying on easy targets and fighting over scraps, but a new force was emerging, one that would change the criminal landscape forever. The city was on the brink of a transformation, and no one could see it coming. The architect of this change was a man known only as the accountant. Very little was ever known about him outside his inner circle. He was not flashy, he did not seek attention, and he rarely used violence unless absolutely necessary. Unlike the street thugs and loud gang leaders, he worked in shadows, calculating every move with meticulous precision. His empire began with something simple yet brilliant, exploiting the shipping industry that had long been Liverpool's lifeblood. Containers full of goods moved in and out of the port every day, and the accountant found ways to hide illegal shipments among them, masking them as ordinary cargo. The docks became his playground, a place where a single misstep could mean death. But a single clever move could generate millions. At first, his methods were almost invisible. Small-time gang members were brought into his operation not through threats, but through opportunity. He offered money, protection, and influence. Slowly, rival operations were absorbed or bought out, and those who resisted found themselves isolated and vulnerable. The accountant never sought chaos. He sought control. In just a few years, he turned a fragmented underworld into a tightly connected network, bound together by loyalty, fear, and the promise of profit. Whispers of the Liverpool Mafia began to circulate, although many dismissed them as exaggerated rumors. No single gang could claim the streets, and yet crime seemed to move in a coordinated way, as if guided by an invisible hand. Shops, pubs, and nightclubs that once operated independently now fell under unseen oversight. The accountant's influence was everywhere, though no one could prove it. People in the city began to notice small patterns. Rival gangs avoiding certain neighborhoods, crimes that seemed calculated rather than impulsive, and a quiet, unspoken understanding that some territories were untouchable. His rise was not without danger. The street gangs he absorbed were unpredictable, often loyal one day and treacherous the next. And though he rarely used violence himself, the accountant understood its power. Murders and disappearances were strategic, carefully timed, to send a message without attracting too much attention. Fear was his currency, loyalty his shield, and secrecy his greatest weapon. By the early 1990s, Liverpool's underworld had changed completely. The small-time fights and petty thefts that once defined the streets were replaced by a well-oiled operation capable of outsmarting law enforcement and rival gangs alike. The accountant's network controlled the flow of money, drugs, and smuggled goods, creating a system where very few were above his reach. Those who worked for him were rewarded generously, but betrayal carried consequences so severe that no one dared test him. The city moved on the surface as if nothing had changed, but in the shadows a silent empire was rising, shaping the lives of countless people without their knowledge. Liverpool had a new ruler, not with a crown, but with a ledger, and the streets were his kingdom. No one could see him, and yet everyone felt his presence. The rise of the accountant marked the beginning of a criminal era that would leave an indelible mark on the city for decades to come, setting the stage for a story of power, betrayal, and fear that would grip Liverpool like never before. By the mid-1990s, the accountant's empire was at its peak. Liverpool's streets were quieter in some ways, but far more dangerous in others. The petty brawls and small-time robberies that once dominated the city had given way to something much darker, an invisible web of control that no one could escape. Every neighborhood, every dock, and even some businesses in the city center had a connection to him, directly or indirectly. To the outside world, Liverpool seemed to be moving on after years of economic struggle, but behind closed doors, fear was spreading like wildfire. The first signs of cracks in the empire appeared quietly. One of the accountant's most trusted lieutenants, a man who had been with him since the early days at the docks, suddenly vanished. No one knew where he went, and no trace was left behind. His disappearance sent a message through the underworld. Betrayal would not be tolerated. Yet the shock was not just in his absence. It was in the realization that even those closest to the accountant could be compromised. Rumors began to circulate that someone on the inside had made a deal with law enforcement, feeding information in secret. The empire, it seemed, was not immune to vulnerability. Violence became a calculated tool. Rival gangs that had once openly challenged the accountant found themselves trapped in an invisible vise. Cars were torched outside nightclubs, warehouses burned under mysterious circumstances, and bodies occasionally turned up in the docks with no explanation. Each act was precise, serving a purpose beyond simple retaliation. It was a statement of control. The streets of Liverpool had never been so silent, yet danger lurked in every shadow. Ordinary citizens rarely realized that the calm they felt was the result of meticulous planning and ruthless intimidation. Despite the fear, the inner workings of the empire remained a mystery to most. The accountant avoided the limelight, rarely meeting anyone personally and conducting business through intermediaries. This secrecy kept him insulated from both rival gangs and law enforcement, making him seem untouchable. But inside his organization, tension was growing. Trust, the most fragile commodity in a criminal empire, was beginning to fray. Every shipment, every deal, carried the invisible weight of suspicion. Allies were no longer certain whether their neighbors were friends or spies. Even the most loyal members started watching their backs, unsure if loyalty alone was enough to survive. Then came the first true shock to the organization, an internal betrayal that no one saw coming. A high-ranking member, responsible for overseeing several major smuggling routes, had been secretly collaborating with authorities for months. Evidence of his cooperation was discovered only by chance, and the revelation caused panic within the ranks. Suddenly, the accountant faced the unimaginable. His empire could collapse from within, not just from rivals outside. Every plan, every operation now carried a risk that had never existed before. Yet, even in the face of betrayal, the accountant adapted quickly. He reinforced his inner circle, eliminated weak links, and implemented stricter rules. Fear became even more central to his strategy, not just as a tool to control enemies, but to maintain loyalty among his own people. The streets of Liverpool, which had already been shaped by his influence, now bore the imprint of paranoia and meticulous discipline. By the end of the decade, the empire was stronger in some ways but more fragile in others. Its power was undeniable, yet the first cracks had appeared. Betrayal, once thought impossible, had become a real threat. The shadow of violence and fear loomed larger than ever, signaling that even the most carefully built criminal empires could face internal collapse. The stage was set for the next chapter of Liverpool's darkest story, one in which secrecy, betrayal, and danger would collide in ways no one could predict. By the late 1990s, it became clear that the Liverpool Mafia was not just a local criminal gang. It was a sophisticated network that stretched far beyond the city's borders. What began as control over docks and local businesses had evolved into a sprawling system capable of influencing entire industries and, in some cases, government operations. Law enforcement, once confident they could contain organized crime to small neighborhoods, were now facing a web that spanned countries, shipping routes, and financial institutions. The accountant's empire was no longer just a citywide menace. It was a global problem hiding in plain sight. At the heart of this network were businesses that seemed legitimate to the casual observer. Fish markets, taxi companies, pubs, and small import-export firms acted as fronts for money laundering and smuggling. Through these businesses, the empire could funnel millions of pounds without ever attracting suspicion. The accountant had perfected the art of invisibility, using layers of employees, intermediaries and fake documents to obscure his involvement. For the average Liverpudlian, life appeared normal, but the veins of criminal enterprise ran quietly beneath every corner of the city. The twist was how seamlessly the network extended beyond Liverpool. Containers leaving the docks often traveled not just to nearby European ports, but as far as Ireland, Spain, and even the Caribbean. Each route was carefully guarded, monitored by loyal lieutenants who ensured that law enforcement or rival gangs never intercepted shipments. This international reach allowed the accountant to trade in goods both legal and illegal, making the empire nearly untouchable. What made it even more chilling was that these operations were coordinated with military-like precision. Every movement, every transaction, was tracked and double-checked. Mistakes were rare and punished severely. Investigators eventually realized that dismantling the empire would require more than traditional policing. Ordinary raids and arrests were only scratching the surface. Each front company, each shipping route, each bank account was connected like a massive spider web. Cutting one thread often revealed a dozen more, each leading further into the shadows. Detectives and intelligence officers found themselves constantly one step behind, uncovering evidence only after shipments had vanished or led to dead ends overseas. For every lead, there was a countermeasure, a diversion, or a hidden observance. Activities found themselves stonewalled or subtly threatened. By the time authorities realized the full scale of the operation, the accountant's reach was staggering, an invisible hand that shaped Liverpool's economy, crime, and politics. Yet for all its sophistication, the network had a weakness. It relied on human loyalty. Trust was the one thing the empire could not automate or guarantee. And as with any empire, cracks were beginning to show. Small betrayals, unnoticed for years, began surfacing. An intercepted shipment here, an unexplained bank transaction there. Each revealed vulnerabilities that law enforcement could exploit. The accountant's world of shadows, once thought impenetrable, was slowly giving hints that it could be breached. By the end of the decade, it was clear that the Liverpool Mafia was no ordinary criminal gang. It was a vast, secretive empire that spanned continents and industries, a network built on fear, money, and cunning. But the very complexity that made it powerful also made it fragile. One misstep, one exposure, could trigger a collapse unlike anything Liverpool had ever seen. And that collapse would be closer than anyone realized. The fall of the Liverpool Mafia began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with a single overlooked mistake. A shipment that should have disappeared without a trace instead contained evidence so damning that it could not be ignored. Hidden within crates marked as mundane goods were documents, ledgers, and encrypted records linking the accountant directly to multiple murders, money laundering operations, and smuggling routes. For the first time, law enforcement had a concrete target, a thread they could pull that might unravel the entire empire. Once the discovery was made, the authorities moved cautiously, but decisively. Unlike previous raids that yielded only minor arrests, these operations were coordinated on a scale Liverpool had never seen. Warehouses were surrounded, offices searched, and clubs raided. Every lieutenant and associate of the accountant was under scrutiny. Panic rippled through the organization. Those who had once felt untouchable now realized the walls of their empire were closing in. No one knew whom to trust, and paranoia spread faster than the city itself could contain. The fall was not immediate, but it was relentless. Key lieutenants began to disappear under suspicious circumstances. Some arrested, others found dead, and a few vanished entirely without explanation. These losses were strategic, both by law enforcement and in some cases by the accountant himself, who reportedly eliminated anyone he suspected of disloyalty. The network that had seemed untouchable for years was fracturing, leaving gaps that exposed the inner workings of the empire. Public awareness of the mafia's influence grew as the raids continued. News reports hinted at corruption, smuggling, and organized violence reaching far beyond Liverpool streets. Ordinary citizens began to understand that the calm they had once taken for granted had been maintained through intimidation and fear. Neighborhoods that had once been considered safe were revealed to have been under constant surveillance and control. The revelation was shocking. The empire had infiltrated not just businesses but daily life itself. The most dramatic and mystifying event of the fall was the disappearance of the accountant. In the chaos of the raids, he vanished completely, leaving behind no trace, no warning, and no explanation. Authorities searched extensively, following every lead, yet all attempts to locate him ended in dead ends. Some believed he had been killed by a rival or even a former associate, while others insisted he had orchestrated his escape with the same precision that had defined his entire empire. His absence left a vacuum that no one could fill, a chilling reminder that the man who had controlled Liverpool's criminal underworld had done so from the shadows, and he could leave the same way. The empire's collapse sent shockwaves through the criminal community. Without its central figure, remaining lieutenants struggled to maintain order. Smuggling routes faltered, businesses once used to launder money were exposed, and rival gangs attempted to seize power. But no one could replicate the meticulous control the accountant had wielded. Fear, loyalty, and obedience, the pillars of the empire, had all been tied to a single individual, and once he was gone, the structure began to crumble under its own weight. Yet even in defeat, the empire left a lasting impact. The methods, the networks, and the connections it had built did not disappear overnight. Investigators found evidence that suggested former members continued operations in smaller, more fragmented ways, while the memory of the accountant's power lingered like a shadow over Liverpool. The city had been transformed by his influence, and even as the empire fell, its legacy of fear, manipulation, and criminal ingenuity remained. The fall of the Liverpool Mafia was not the end of organized crime in the city. It was a dramatic turning point. It revealed the fragility of even the most powerful empires and exposed the dangers of unchecked influence. More than anything, it proved that in the world of shadows, one misstep could trigger a chain reaction capable of toppling even the most untouchable kingpins. Liverpool had survived the storm, but the echoes of its darkest years would resonate for decades to come. Even after the empire fell, the shadow of the Liverpool Mafia lingered over the city like a low, persistent hum that no one could escape. The streets had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memories of fear, betrayal, and control remained deeply embedded in the city's fabric. Ordinary citizens carried stories of neighbors who vanished without explanation, of businesses that had quietly served as fronts, and of a city where one man's influence had reached every corner, unseen yet undeniable. Former gang members scrambled to fill the void left by the accountant, but none could match the precision, intelligence, or ruthlessness of the man who had ruled from the shadows. The once tight network fractured into smaller, rival factions, each competing for scraps of territory and control. Violence surged in short bursts, but it was chaotic and uncoordinated, lacking the invisible hand that had kept the city's criminal activities so meticulously organized. Liverpool was no longer under the rule of a single mastermind, but the effects of his reign continued to echo in every alleyway and dockyard. The accountant himself became a legend, a figure spoken of in whispers and speculation. Some claimed he had been killed during the fall of the empire. Others insisted he had vanished, slipping into a life of unimaginable wealth somewhere overseas. His true fate remained unknown, and that uncertainty only amplified his mystique. To this day, Liverpool remembers him not only as a criminal, but as a ghostly presence, a man who wielded power without ever being seen, whose influence could topple rivals and bend the city to his will. Even law enforcement recognized the lasting mark of his empire. Investigators discovered that while the large-scale operations had been dismantled, the techniques and systems he built were still in use. Smaller criminal networks had adopted his methods, laundering money, controlling neighborhoods, and moving contraband with care. The accountant's empire had taught a generation of criminals that meticulous planning, secrecy, and fear were more powerful than brute force alone. The lessons he left behind became part of Liverpool's criminal DNA. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of all was the psychological imprint he left on the city. Ordinary citizens learned to navigate the streets with caution, avoiding certain areas, businesses, and people. Even decades later, Older residents could recall the subtle signs of control: who held influence in which pubs, which docks were off-limits, and which neighborhoods had been quietly policed by unseen eyes. The accountant had proven that fear, even when invisible, could shape behavior just as effectively as law or authority. The story of the Liverpool Mafia became a cautionary tale. It was a reminder that criminal empires do not rise overnight, and that power, when combined with intelligence and secrecy, can infiltrate every aspect of society. It also showed the fragility of such power, how one overlooked mistake could trigger a collapse that exposed everything. The city had survived the empire, but it was forever changed. Every corner of Liverpool carried echoes of the past, from the docks where smuggling once thrived to the empty warehouses that had concealed its operation. Ultimately, the empire's fall did not erase its influence, it transformed it. The accountant was gone, but the fear, tactics, and cunning he embodied remained embedded in the city. Liverpool had moved forward, but the ghost of the mafia's reign lingered, a constant reminder that power can rise quietly, spread unnoticed, and leave a lasting mark, long after the kingpin has disappeared. Liverpool had survived, but the story of the mafia was never truly over. The city's streets carried its memory, its lessons, and its shadow. And somewhere in the minds of those who lived through it, the accountant remained alive, a legend, a phantom, and a chilling testament to how one man's vision could control an entire city without